about it. So I really questioned why that was the case, and my best reading of it was that in the era we're talking about, the 1920s, this is a first moment of Catholic assimilation to a certain degree, but it's also the decade after the end of the Great War, and the desolation of that war and the absolute destruction of so many convents, abbeys, monasteries in Europe produced an enormously melancholy feeling among a lot of Catholics. So there was a certain fear that vocations were declining, not because their numbers were going down, but simply because their infrastructure had been wiped out. So Americans gave very generously to fund things like fellowships for new priests and to help rebuild these buildings. I did a lot of my research, or some of the research at the University of Louvain, and one thing that strikes you when you walk around the library at Louvain, which was destroyed by bombing in World War I, are all the plaques that appear on the outside of the monies given by American universities and a lot of Catholic foundations to help rebuild it. So Americans were involved to some degree in this rebuilding effort, and even though we think of Manhattan in the Jazz Age as all these fabulous things and people like Jay Gatsby running around and so forth, for Catholics there was this sense of the desolation of their own heritage and how would they recoup that. So to some degree Margaret Riley was the right figure at the right time because she hoped to appeal to all these notions of the mystic as the leader who will show us a way to go. And as you pointed out, yeah, her revelations were kind of lame, right? They were rather trite and not very detailed. She didn't produce anything like a Teresa of Avila or a Catherine of Siena, though she tried to link herself in conversation with those figures, and others did as well. But when Jesus would say to her things like, postulants going out without permission, nuns wearing dirty shoes. These were expressing very local concerns about her convent and the kind of fights and infighting that often drove religious congregations into great problems, right? So these were the things that would vex the Archbishop. Oh, those stupid nuns at 90th Street, they're fighting about their mantles again. But these were the big fights that a lot of the women engaged in. So when Margaret made those kind of comments, I have to believe she was answering very concrete issues that they were fighting about locally or even regionally. And I also find it fascinating that because she was the convent switchboard operator, she knew when the Archbishop was contacting the Superior and who the Superior was contacting in the outside world about some of these issues. So I have to think her ability to overhear some of these things lent a little pointedness to some of her messages, which gives them a very homey and localized quality, but not such a very distinguished mystical quality in many ways. But I do think that she was led very much to her sense of what a mystic was by the contact she had with her spiritual directors and confessors. So that bond between, penitent, nun, and confessor was very strong. And for those of you who've read medieval and early modern historiography, you know that people like Jody Belinkoff and others have done great work on those connections. So in Margaret's case, someone like Lucas Etlin and others were incredibly formative of her sense of spirituality, I think. And a lot of that came for sisters through pamphlet reading, right? So this whole creation of a print culture world in the late 19th century and early 20th was part of what made her what she was, that she was able to suddenly read about St. Gertrude or Catherine Emmerich, and then you find her modeling some of her behaviors on those figures. So in a sense, she's a very imitative mystic. She's trying really hard to fill the part. So if you found her revelations somewhat flat, yes, they probably are. And I can't really speak to her own spirituality. Her writing is so limited. As I said, I don't have anything in her own hand except for these lines on holiday cards to relatives and friends. And part of that was always spoken of in the convent as modesty that was required of nuns. They cannot speak of themselves. They should not think of themselves in the first person. They should not develop a sense of ego and individuality. Be that as it may, I think she was so uneducated that she wasn't a very profound writer, and the few things that we have are kind of incoherent, somewhat like Lucas Etlin's writings to her. They're often very, to me, they showed the stress of people who slept very little, worked hard and were often up in the wee hours of the morning writing in their spiritual diaries. So you see a lot of cross-outs on the page, a lot of Xing out, a lot of changing of words, and this constant prayerfulness that comes out of the sort of prayer cards Ron mentioned is what you see. Very formulaic words of prayer, words of spiritual direction that they just repeat over and over. So it has kind of mantra quality to a lot of the things she would say, but nothing particularly profound that I noticed. Is that a good place to stop for the time being? I can deal with.
It's fine. There's do you have one a little more? I mean, there's plenty of questions that we can address in conversation.
Oh,
so
okay,
maybe,
okay.
I don't want to cut you off. I really don't like doing
that. In terms of the very world that's conveyed by someone like Sister Thorn and her generation, I mean, obviously this whole devotional world will change dramatically with Vatican II. And another thing that struck me about many of the people involved with her, particularly, let's say someone like Virgil Michel on the fringes out there in Collegeville, Minnesota, or even Sister Carmelita Quinn. These folks went on to become remarkable liturgical revivalists in the 50s and 60s. So they came out of the world she was in and went on to something very different. So one of the things that struck me in following the work being done by a lot of you at Kushwa, particularly in the Vatican II project, was that we're pushing back further and further our sense of when Vatican II reforms began. And it sort of surprised me that someone like Carmelita, who is so invested in Sister Thorn and spent such a long time at the convent in Peekskill, writing about her with such devotion, and as an even more cloistered figure than Sister Thorn was, Carmelita will go on to become one of the leaders in the Leadership Conference of Women's Religious, and she'll become very active in revisions of laws governing convent life in the way that women religious understood themselves. So I'm not trying to suggest that one was hopefully stuck in Catholic devotional world until magically in 1965, and then voila, new Catholics emerge. But what started to emerge at the end of the project for me was this sense of people who made that transition very successfully using these kind of resources to form a very different type of Catholicism. I think if Sister Thorn had lived on through the 50s or 60s, that she probably would not have made that transition very easily, because it kind of even more marginalized figures like her on the outside of things. I don't know if she would have discovered Jesus as the liberator of the oppressed or the magic of social justice things or not, but she certainly did seem to have uncovered a role for herself in a kind of interesting symbiosis between the people that were devoted to her and pushed her along, and her own family life, which was all about creating this hyper-pious young Catholic girl. So in a sense, she seemed to come to a lot of this work belatedly, right? Because she was not a youngster when she entered the convent. She was in her late 30s. And I found it fascinating that men were always mistaking her for someone in their 20s, and then others thinking she was already menopausal at age 37. So a weird question about how old she really was. So she seemed to have a kind of magnetism that led people to think she was different age than what she was, and partly that's the disguise of the whole habit the nuns were wearing. But it is peculiar to me that she was able to sustain these relationships over a relatively long period of time with people who were determined to project certain things onto her. So I think I will stop there, and I'll deal with the more difficult social theory questions after I have some more coffee.
That's a great idea. So thank you, Ron and Mary Ellen, for setting up what's going to be a very interesting conversation, and Paula for your response. We'll take a break for about 10 minutes just to refresh coffee, and we'll come back and then open the larger conversation.
Always works. Oh, I have no purgatory time coming.